Hello everyone, and welcome back to Red Room Stories. I know many of you tune into these tales to help you drift off to sleep. So before we settle in, I'd love for each of you to leave a comment sharing where in the world you're listening from. And if you're enjoying the episodes, don't forget to give a like and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's get comfortable, relax, and begin. The dusk settled heavy over the plains, painting the horizon in shades of ash as Simon trudged across the cracked earth. His flashlight cut through the gloom, its beam jittery in his trembling hand, searching for his brother, Theo, who'd vanished after a cryptic call about a discovery out here. The message had ended in static, Theo's voice sharp with panic, and now Simon was alone, the wind whistling through the dry grass, carrying a faint, sour whiff of decay. He clutched Theo's dog tags, found near a rusted fence, their metal cold against his palm, urging him onward into the fading light. A rumble stirred the ground, low and guttural, shaking the dirt beneath Simon's boots. He froze, sweeping the light across the expanse, its glow catching on skeletal bushes and a dip in the land where shadows pooled deep. The rumble pulsed, slow and rhythmic, like breathing, drawing him toward the hollow where the grass thinned to bare soil. He shouted Theo's name, his voice swallowed by the vastness, answered only by a faint, hollow knock from below. His pulse quickened as he stepped closer, the air growing colder, heavier with each breath. The hollow revealed a sinkhole, its edges jagged, its center plunging into darkness, lined with roots that twisted like veins. Simon's light trembled as it traced the rim, landing on Theo's cap caught in the tangle, its brim stained with something dark and tacky. The rumble deepened, vibrating up his legs, and he knelt, peering into the abyss, the beam illuminating a shaft that spiraled downward, its walls slick with moisture. A scrape echoed from within, sharp and deliberate, and his stomach lurched, dread prickling his skin. Something moved in the shadows beyond the hollow, swift and low, darting out of sight as Simon swung the light. The knock came again, louder, joined by a creak that slithered through the air, unnatural against the wind's howl. He called for Theo once more, his voice cracking, and the creak turned into a moan, soft and layered, rising from the sinkhole. He backed away, clutching the cap, his boots sinking into the soft earth. The moan grew, weaving with the rumble, a chorus that pressed against his skull. He edged toward the sinkhole, lowering the light, its beam catching on a ledge below, cluttered with debris bones, cloth, metal all coated in a glistening film. Simon's breath fogged as he leaned closer, spotting Theo's watch, its face cracked, nestled among the remains. The moan sharpened, and a hand shot from the shadows, pale and clawing, scraping the ledge before vanishing. He stumbled back, the flashlight slipping, its beam spinning wildly across the hollow, the rumble shaking the ground beneath him. Footsteps crunched behind him, slow and uneven, stirring the dust with each heavy tread. Simon turned, the light quivering, catching a glimpse of a figure tall, its limbs bent wrong, its head lolling as if unmoored before it melted into the dusk. The footsteps circled, closing in, and he ran toward the sinkhole, clutching the watch, the moan rising into a wail that split the night. Shapes emerged along the hollow's edge, their silhouettes swaying, too many to count, their presence a weight on the air. The shaft beckoned, and Simon slid down its incline, the walls closing tight, the air thick with damp and rot. His light flickered, revealing scratches gouged into the stone frantic, overlapping, stretching deeper as he descended. The wail followed, echoing through the tunnel, joined by a wet, dragging sound that sent chills racing up his spine. He landed in a cavern, its ceiling low, its floor slick with puddles that reflected the beam in oily glints. Theo's jacket lay crumpled in the center, soaked and heavy, surrounded by bones still wet with marrow. A figure loomed from the dark, its frame draped in tatters, its head bowed over a pile of debris. Simon's light shook as he stepped closer, recognizing Theo's boots, but the figure turned, revealing a face of cracked skin and empty sockets, its mouth gaping in a lipless grin. It lunged, and he swung the flashlight, cracking it against the thing's jaw, the bulb shattering, plunging the cavern into blackness. The whale multiplied, shapes shifting in the shadows, their claws scraping stone as they closed in. He bolted, hands groping for the tunnel. The creatures pursued, their drags and scrapes filling the air, their bodies pressing through the tight passage. Simon clawed upward, the stone biting his palms, the jacket slipping from his grasp as he reached the surface. He burst into the hollow, the plains alive with movement figures swaying, their heads tilted, the whale a deafening roar. The ground trembled, the sinkhole widening, swallowing the edges as he ran, the night blurring around him. He tripped, tumbling into a ditch, the watch glinting in the dirt beside him. Simon staggered free, the plains stretching endless under the ashen sky. The rumble fading, the figures gone. His flashlight lay broken, the watch clutched tight, its hands frozen at the hour of Theo's last call. A farmer found him wandering a back road, dust-caked and muttering, the film still clinging to his clothes. He told his story at a roadside shack, the owner listening with a furrowed brow, pouring coffee he didn't drink. The farmer glanced outside, the hollow's faint outline on the horizon, and stayed silent, his hands steady but pale. The next day, Simon led deputies to the hollow, but the sinkhole had vanished, the ground smooth, the bones and jacket nowhere in sight. They shrugged, suggesting shock or a trick of the dark, but their eyes lingered on the watch, its ticking faint and erratic. He returned home, the apartment cold, Theo's cap inexplicably on the table, dry but stained. Sleep eluded him, the rumble echoing in his ears, the film's chill lingering on his skin. One night, the lights dimmed, and the rumble surged, shaking the walls. Simon grabbed a knife, the watch glowing faintly, its hands spinning backward as shadows stretched across the room. The wail seeped through the floor, joined by knocks against the windows, the ceiling, the door. He barricaded himself in, the knife raised, but the shadows thickened, hands pressing through the walls, pale and dripping. The windows cracked, dust swirling inward, and the lights died, the rumble swallowing his cries. Morning broke, the apartment empty, the knife on the floor, the watch gone, the door stood locked, the windows intact despite the cracks. Simon vanished. A neighbor heard wails in the night, saw shapes slink toward the plains, but the deputies found no tracks, no trace. The case faded, lost to the hollow silence, its secrets buried beneath the cracked earth. The plains stretched on, their shadows long and still, drawing whispers of lost souls and hidden depths. Simon's name joined the tales, carried on the wind, a caution to those who wandered too far into the dusk's embrace. The night pressed close, stars obscured by a thick shroud of clouds, as Leah ventured across the windswept cliffs. Her lantern swung in her hand, its flame dancing wildly, casting fleeting shadows on the rocky edge, as she searched for her cousin Dana, lost after a frantic text about something on the coast. The message had cut off abruptly, leaving only a photo of jagged rocks and a blurry shape in the distance. The wind howled, sharp with salt and a faint fishy rot, tugging at Leah's coat as she moved forward. She gripped Dana's locket, found tangled in seaweed near the shore, its chain biting into her palm. The path ended at a cave, its entrance yawning wide, the tide lapping at its jagged mouth. Leah's lantern trembled as she stepped inside, the flame glinting on wet stone and strands of kelp draped like curtains. The air was cold, heavy with brine, and her light caught on something ahead Dana's bag, sodden and torn, its contents spilling across the floor. The thudding grew louder, vibrating through the walls, and she knelt, finding a trail of dark smears leading deeper into the cave. Her breath fogged as she traced them, the hiss sharpening into a wet, rasping breath. A shape flickered in the dark, swift and sinuous, slithering beyond the lantern's reach. Leah swung the light, its glow brushing damp walls and pools that rippled without wind, but nothing emerged. The hiss came again, closer, curling around her like the tide, and she backed away, clutching the bag, its weight slick against her side. Something glinted in a puddle Dana's ring, its band bent, half submerged in the water. She fished it out, the liquid clinging to her fingers, cold and oily, and the thudding surged, shaking the cave. Footsteps splashed behind her, slow and deliberate, stirring the pools with each heavy stride. Leah turned, the lantern quaking, catching a glimpse of a figure tall, its limbs glistening, its head bowed as water streamed from its form before it vanished into the shadows. The footsteps echoed, circling the cave, and she pressed against the wall, shouting Dana's name, her voice brittle against the hiss. The figure tilted its head, a gesture too fluid, too wrong, and the splashes multiplied. Shapes rising from the water, their silhouettes swaying in the dim light. Leah ran deeper into the cave, the tunnel narrowing, the walls slick with slime that burned her hands. The hiss swelled into a chorus, voices bubbling up, some whispering her name, others choking on garbled cries. Her lantern flickered, revealing scratches gouged into the stone of desperate, overlapping, stretching into the dark. The water rose, lapping at her knees, slowing her as she pushed forward, the figures closing in, their steps silent now beneath the tide. Her light caught on handspale, webbed reaching from the pools, grasping before sinking back. A tunnel opened into a chamber, its ceiling dripping with jagged stalactites, its floor flooded with black water that shimmered under the flame. Leah's light swept across it, landing on a pile of debris bones, shells, fabric piled against the wall, Dana's coat tangled among them, its sleeves trailing in the tide. The thudding thundered, the water trembling, and a figure rose from the center, its body draped in kelp, its head bowed over the surface. She stepped closer, recognizing Dana's boots, but it turned, revealing a face of scales and hollow slits, its mouth gaping with needle-like teeth. It lunged, and Leah swung the lantern, the glass shattering against its skull, flame flaring briefly before drowning in the water. The chamber plunged into darkness, the hiss exploding into screeches as other shapes surged from the tide, their claws slashing the air. She stumbled back, the bag slipping, her hands groping for the tunnel as the creatures closed in, their bodies slick and writhing. She fought through the water, the screeches deafening, the chamber shaking as she clawed her way out, the tide pulling at her legs. Back in the tunnel, Leah waded upward, the slime searing her skin, the ring clutched tight as the creatures splashed behind her. She burst into the cave's mouth, the cliffs looming above, the sea alive with shapes breaching the waves, their screeches piercing the wind. The path crumbled under her weight, rocks tumbling into the water, and she climbed, the figures scaling the cliff below, their claws scraping stone. She reached the top, collapsing as dawn bled into the sky, faint and gray, the screeches fading into the surf. A coast guard found her, soaked and muttering, the ring still in her hand, its metal warm despite the cold. He drove her to a shack, where she sat, staring at the sea, Dana's locket heavy in her pocket. She spoke of the cave, the figures, the tide, her words spilling out, met with a nod and a glance toward the cliffs. The Coast Guard listened, his face tight, offering a blanket she ignored. The sheriff arrived, but Leah stayed silent, lost in the thudding still echoing in her bones. The sheriff searched the coast, Leah trailing behind, pointing to the cave, but the tide had risen, sealing it beneath the waves, no trace of bones or coat. He sighed, suggesting exhaustion or grief, but his eyes lingered on the slime on her hands, the ring's bent shape. She left without protest, the sea's silence mocking her, its secrets submerged in the depths. Back home, the apartment felt damp. Dana's bag inexplicably on the table, dry but reeking of brine. Sleep came in shards, broken by the thudding pulsing through the walls, the hiss threading her dreams. Leah kept the lights on, the ring on her nightstand, its surface gleaming faintly in the dark. One night, the power flickered, and the thudding sharpened, rattling the floor, the windows misting with salt from outside. She grabbed a knife, her hands shaking, the screeches weaving through the room, low and wet. Shadows stretched across the walls, clawed and glistening, and the door buckled, water seeping beneath it. Morning arrived, the apartment empty, the knife on the floor, the ring gone. The window stood locked, the door unbreached, yet Leah had vanished, leaving only a puddle of black water by the sink. A neighbor heard screeches in the night, saw shapes slink toward the cliffs, but the sheriff found no tracks, no trace. The case faded, lost to the sea's depths, its waves rolling on. The cliffs stood silent, their edges sharp, the tide whispering to those who lingered too long. Tales grew of a cave that opened in the dark, of voices rising from the water, luring the lost into its grasp. Leah's name joined the stories, carried on the wind, a warning etched into the coastal night. The twilight hung thick over the barren fields, casting long shadows as Elise trudged through the brittle stalks. Her flashlight wavered in her grip, its beam slicing the dark, searching for her father Paul, who'd vanished after a late-night drive, leaving only a garbled voicemail about lights in the distance. The message had ended in a sharp gasp, and now Elise was here, the wind hissing through the dry grass, tinged with a faint, acrid stench. She clutched Paul's keychain, found dangling from a fence post, its metal warm despite the chill, pulling her deeper into the emptiness. A pulse rippled through the earth, soft at first, then stronger, stirring the dirt beneath her feet. Elise stopped, swinging the light across the field, its glow catching on twisted weeds and a dip where the ground sank unnaturally. The pulse quickened, a steady throb echoing in her chest, guiding her toward the hollow where the stalks parted like a wound. She called Paul's name, her voice thin against the vastness, answered only by a faint, metallic clank from below. Her throat tightened, but she pressed on, the keychain jingling in her hand. The hollow cradled a pit, its edges crumbling, its depths shrouded in shadow, lined with vines that pulsed faintly. Elise's light shook as she traced the rim, spotting Paul's hat, caught in the vines, its brim crusted with a dark, sticky film. The pulse deepened, thrumming up her legs, and she leaned closer, the beam revealing a shaft that plunged downward, its walls slick with a sheen that glinted red. A rustle rose from within, slow and deliberate, and her stomach churned, fear rooting her in place. A shadow darted beyond the pit, low and jerky, vanishing as Elise swept the light. The clank sounded again, sharper, joined by a creak that slithered through the air, alien against the wind's whine. She shouted for Paul, her voice breaking, and the creak morphed into a hum, low and layered, seeping from the pit. She stepped back, clutching the hat, her boots sinking into the loose soil. The hum grew, weaving with the pulse, a symphony pressing against her skull. She peered into the shaft, the light catching on a ledge below, strewn with debris bones, fabric, tool saw coated in that red sheen. Elise's breath clouded as she spotted Paul's belt, its buckle dented, tangled in the mess. The hum sharpened, and a hand lunged from the dark, pale and gnarled, clawing the ledge before retreating. She stumbled back, the flashlight slipping, its beam spinning across the hollow, the pulse shaking the ground beneath her. Footsteps shuffled behind her, heavy and uneven, kicking up dust with each slow step. Elise turned, the light trembling, glimpsing a figure tall, its arms too long, its head cocked at an odd angle before it melted into the dusk. The footsteps circled, tightening around her, and she bolted toward the pit, clutching the belt, the hum rising into a wail that pierced the night. Shapes loomed along the hollow's edge, their forms swaying, too numerous to track, their weight thickening the air. The shaft called, and Elise slid down its slope, the walls pressing close, the air thick with damp and rust. Her light flickered, illuminating gashes carved into the stone wild, overlapping, stretching deeper as she fell. The wail echoed, joined by a dragging rasp that sent shivers down her spine. She landed in a chamber, its ceiling low, its floor slick with puddles that shimmered under the beam. Paul's coat lay in the center, soaked in red, surrounded by bones still glistening with flesh. A figure hunched in the shadows, its frame cloaked in tatters, its head bowed over a pile of remains. Elise's light quaked as she approached, recognizing Paul's boots, but the figure turned, revealing a face of cracked flesh and hollow eyes, its mouth gaping in a toothless grin. It lunged, and she swung the flashlight. shattering it against its skull, the bulb bursting, plunging the chamber into darkness. The whale swelled, shapes shifting in the black, their claws scraping stone as they surged forward. She ran, hands fumbling for the shaft. The creatures chased, their rasps and drags filling the air, their bodies crowding the narrow passage. Elise clawed upward, the stone cutting her palms, the coat slipping as she reached the surface. She burst into the hollow, the fields alive with moving figures swaying, their heads tilted, the wail a deafening roar. The ground quaked, the pit widening, swallowing the edges as she fled, the dusk blurring around her. She tripped, tumbling into a trench, the belt glinting beside her in the dirt. Elise crawled free, the fields endless under the clouded sky, the pulse fading, the figures gone. Her flashlight lay shattered, the belt clutched tight, its buckle warm against her skin. A trucker found her on a gravel road, dust-streaked and muttering, the red film still clinging to her hands. She told her story at a diner, the waitress listening with a blank stare, pouring coffee she didn't touch. The trucker glanced outside, the hollow's faint silhouette on the horizon, and stayed quiet, his grip firm on his cup. The next day, Elise guided rangers to the hollow, but the pit had vanished, the ground smooth, the bones and coat nowhere to be seen. They shrugged, suggesting fatigue or a trick of the light, but their eyes lingered on the belt, its buckle faintly pulsing under the sun. She returned home, the apartment cold, Paul's hat inexplicably on the counter, dry but heavy. Sleep evaded her, the pulse echoing in her ears, the film's sting lingering on her flesh. One night, the lights dimmed and the pulse surged, rattling the walls. Elise grabbed a knife, the belt glowing faintly, its buckle thrumming as shadows stretched across the room. The wail seeped through the floor, joined by clanks against the windows, the ceiling, the door. She barricaded herself in, the knife raised, but the shadows deepened, hands pressing through the walls, pale and dripping. The windows cracked, dust swirling inward, and the lights died, the pulse drowning her screams. Morning came, the apartment empty, the knife on the floor, the belt gone. The door remained locked, the windows intact despite the cracks. Elise vanished. A neighbor heard wails in the night, saw shapes slink toward the fields, but the rangers found no tracks, no trace. The case faded, lost to the hollow silence, its secrets buried beneath the barren earth. The fields stretched on, their shadows long and still, whispering tales of lost souls and hidden depths. Elisa's name joined the stories, carried on the wind, a warning etched into the twilight's embrace.